Wits University has suspended scores of protesting students who went on the rampage over a lack of accommodation and financial exclusion. Let's get some perspective now, and we speak to Khaya Sithole, an independent analyst. Khaya, good morning to you, and thank you very much for your time. Before we get into what you would have been part of previously, and that was to write proposals about how financially excluded students ought to be rescued from this situation. Give us your sense of how tertiary institutions ought to handle the latest bout of protests by students.
Good morning to the viewers. Yeah, look, I think the fact that the protests at universities are an annual occurrence means that universities should have a much more proactive way of dealing with the issues before they get to the streets. And the problem seems to be a lot of the universities do not really have a granular understanding of what the big trigger points are. So a trigger point at the beginning of an academic year is usually the question of how many students who have met the academic requirements to progress into another academic year are then unable to do so because they are hamstrung by the debt accumulated in previous years. A secondary problem that has always been an issue is in relation to students that are funded by the state, in that the state funding agency, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, is remarkably notorious for really not having its ducks in a row. So students would be told that they are funded only to discover at the end of the year that their fees have not been honored. And unfortunately, a couple of years ago, during the leadership of Mr. Susan Masana at the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, they undertook a remarkably self-defeating process of centralizing the NSFAS processes at the NSFAS head office rather than at the university level. And you can imagine when you've got 26 different universities and hundreds and thousands of students, all of them trying to get an answer about their funding status from one particular agency that is undercapacitated and underfunded, you can sort of see how the picture is going to be at the beginning of each year. So this is unfortunately the consequence of the mistakes that we've made in the past.
Well, let's try to drill deeper. Let's talk about what Wits University says it has found through their preliminary investigations, and that is that some students are indeed academically excluded because they have failed on several occasions, and therefore their funding has subsequently been withdrawn. Surely an institution can't be held accountable for that?
Well, so the big issue here is that you'd imagine that the university has got very granular insights onto the academic and the funding status of its students. If the university has got the profile of its students, it will then know that at the beginning of the year, these are the people who are going to be coming back trying to either get their academic exclusions to be waived or any other reason that they can't try to come into the system for. It is difficult to imagine that the process that you see on the street is on the basis that students have been academically excluded, because it is a small fraction of students that ever get academically excluded at any point in time. So I do not believe that what we see on the streets is simply reflective of the question of people who insist on being admitted into the system even though they haven't met academic requirements. The bigger problem here is that even students who do qualify to come back, students who do qualify to progress into another year, they are inadequately funded. And what we also know is that in recent months, NSFAS has taken an extraordinary decision of assuming that all academic accommodation costs across the entire system must be uniform. In other words, they are simply saying that we will only pay up to 45,000 rand for your academic accommodation costs. Now, the problem with that model is that many years ago, we actually specified to NSFAS that there is definitely a problem, particularly with the urban institutions, where the cost of accommodation for facilities around those particular institutions are really determined with reference to the market conditions out there. So if you imagine the demand for accommodation in Braamfontein simply means that the accommodation providers in Braamfontein aren't really focusing on the student market primarily, but on the market at large. And if the market says that, look, people can afford to pay 60,000 rand for accommodation, well, then that becomes the cost of accommodation around the campus. So if NSFAS then says that we're only going to pay 45,000 rand, the question that naturally emerges is how the gap is going to be covered. And if that gap is not going to be covered, should the students even bother to occupy the room in the first place? Because once you move in at the beginning of the year, you've got a 12-month lease, and you know that you're not going to be able to pay the money at the end of the year. You're inevitably going to have a problem. So there's been a bit of a a policy misdirection in the sense that until NSFAS was in a position to explain to us exactly where the spikes are in accommodation costs and whether they feel that students at the University of Pretoria are still going to be able to live in those accommodation facilities once the funding cap has been introduced. It does look like we've pressed the trigger a bit too early, and it was inevitable that students would then take to the streets.
Yeah. Let me borrow from your words that you've just used, misdirection. You said earlier that it was a bad decision for NSFAS to centralize the administration of this at head office. This should have gone to the actual institutions themselves. Do you believe that that is where, in fact, the solution lies, given that the institutions have that granular data or information about their students?
Yeah, it wasn't a bad decision. It was a catastrophic decision. I think we cannot underestimate the impact of it, because what used to happen before is institutions will say, look, we have received so many applications of students who fall within the ambit of being funded by the state. These are the causes in which they're registered for, so therefore, here's the list of our students, therefore, please do send us the money. What we'll do is that once you've sent us the money, we'll then allocate it to tuition fees, we'll then allocate it to accommodation fees for those students that are housed within university environment, and then we'll also allocate the excess onto, living allowances. So what that meant is that whenever there were disconnects within the system, so a student who hasn't received their allowance or a student who hasn't received confirmation of funding, it became easier for them to engage with the financial aid office at that institution to check whether that financial aid office has indeed said to NSFAS, this one is registered here, this is one of our students, and this student has applied to your facilities and they've met the requirements, so therefore please approve the funding. So it made that interaction point a bit closer, which meant that students would firstly engage with the university, and only in exceptional cases would students then simply say, well, we've got a problem. The secondary dimension is that once the model had been centralized, universities became neutralized. They basically became the places where they would say, well, we do not know, go speak to NSFAS. The problem here is that when universities are scattered all over the country, if there's 1,000 students who cannot get a funding decision and they're based in Johannesburg, for example, those students cannot go and march to the offices of NSFAS to get the decisions to be fast-tracked. They can only complain at the university itself where they are. So now you suddenly have 26 different protests across 26 different universities, and the universities legitimately say, well, actually, we do not have the powers to intervene because we do not even have the ability to check what your funding status is. We do not have the ability to then assess whether you will be funded or not. So that's what has created the problem. So you see what's happening in Braamfontein is something that literally should be happening in Bellville, where NSFAS should be answering to the sins of its own practices.
What's the ultimate solution?
Well, the ultimate solution is that you have to have the system adequately funded, and unfortunately, the government doesn't believe that higher education ought to be as adequately funded as it needs to be. We've had these deliberations over many years, and the state seems to always revert back to the constitutional proviso. Because in the Constitution, when we look at basic education, it makes it very clear that the state must make it immediately available, so there are no questions to be asked. If a young person says, I want to be in school in basic education, the state is duty-bound to make it available immediately. Yeah. When it comes to higher education, unfortunately, what the Constitution said is that the state must make it progressively available, in other words, subject to resources. Now, the problem with that particular proviso is that if the state doesn't make the resources available, if the state doesn't make additional resources available in every single year, given the fact that the costs of providing higher education keep escalating, then it means that you are not moving any closer towards that issue of universal access. So until the state takes the policy of figuring out how the higher education system ought to be funded adequately so that we know for the next 5 or 10 years this is what the rules are and this is what the funding parameters are, you're unfortunately not only going to see this recurring every single year, but you're going to see it recurring at multiple institutions. And the damage that it causes, unfortunately, in terms of infrastructure losses is something that, ironically, the state eventually has to step up and fix anyway because they still are responsible for maintaining university infrastructure.
Yeah. I want to conclude this conversation, Khaya, with something that we are observing once again when it comes to the actual protests now that are taking place on campuses. So these protests, they start off as being peaceful, and then students decide to go on the rampage. I listened to an interview recently of the outgoing UCT professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, and she made the commentary almost as a badge of honor that in her institution, she refused flat out to allow for security to be on campus, whether it be police or indeed private security. Wits University, it's a completely different story. In fact, the security have been called upon immediately to deal with violence, and they are very clear that they're not going to tolerate those who disrupt classes. What do you think is the solution there?
Yeah, but anyway, many years ago, we had this particular problem with Wits University in that what tends to happen is that students congregate, as it is indeed their legal right to be able to congregate. But once a university or an institution reacts by bringing private security forces in particular, which is what we used to be subjected to during the days of Adam Habib at Wits, it becomes inevitable that that particular protest action escalates, because you can imagine when students are seeing guns being brandished in front of them and tear gas being brandished in front of them, their instinctive reaction is to fight back rather than retreat. So the escalation in violence is actually motivated by the presence of security forces within campus, which is why when you look at the case of UCT in particular, they took a principled decision that, look, it appears that whenever we bring private security on campus, it only escalates rather than de-escalates the tension. So that's why Professor Pakeng was very adamant that she would never advocate for the presence of police on campus, because we have never seen the benefit of police presence and even private security as Wits is fond to do being on campus. And that is something that you'd imagine that the various vice-chancellors would by now have the presence of mind to understand that clearly, historically, we've understood how these particular manifestations of protests work, what happens when you bring security on campus and when you don't bring security on campus. So when you then see what escalates into violence in relation to the Wits protests in particular, it's unfortunately a reaction to what students perceive as an immediate threat when you've got people with guns versus students who have nothing more than access to a rock standing right next to them.
Yeah, but then again, Khaya Sithole, the behavior of students cannot be excused. There's no reason why they would trash shops outside of the campus. And whilst on the one hand, we can definitely sympathize with them sleeping in libraries, because these are the latest reports that some of them are sleeping in passageways, that is simply deplorable. That student cannot possibly concentrate in class. But then again, when they're going to go out then and vent their anger in that fashion, how should they be treated?
I mean, we've seen this particular tragedy, particularly in Braamfontein around 2015 and 2016, where students would indeed leave the campus and then start trashing infrastructure, business and private infrastructure, which is completely inexcusable. And I think what seems to be the problem here is that South Africa has got this universal practice where people that go out, whether it's a service delivery protest or some other anxieties, they tend to feel that they get ignored by the state until there is a manifestation of violence in one form or another. So when you see what happens during service delivery protests, they actually happen every single day in South Africa. You and I only get to report on the ones where suddenly there's been an escalation in tensions, where there's been a sense of violence. And when you start to deliberate on the question of, well, why exactly did the infrastructure have to be victimized in relation to this? You get answers that simply say that, well, until we did this, they were ignoring us. And I think, unfortunately, the behavior of the students that we see when they go outside the confines of campus reflects a very broken state of our society, where violence seems to be the instinctive reaction that gets a reaction from authorities. And that is something that South Africa at large needs to deal with.
Khaya Sithole, thank you very much for your insights. He is one of the people who wrote a paper, and it had to do with the proposal of how to deal with financially excluded students.